A millionaire CEO found a little girl crying over her torn teddy bear. What happened next shocked everyone. The sun was beginning to sink behind the tall buildings, casting a golden glow over the small kindergarten yard. Children's laughter echoed through the space, shrill and carefree, but one sound broke through the cheerful noise, the quiet, choked sobs of a little girl crouched on the ground. Her knees were pressed together, her small hands trembling as she clutched a white teddy bear whose head had been cruelly torn off. The toy's stuffing spilled out like snow, and the girl's brown eyes were blurred with tears. Her name was Lily, just 5 years old, with brown hair that curled softly against her cheeks, but in that moment her face carried a sorrow far too heavy for her age. Around her, several children pointed fingers and laughed loudly, mocking her grief as if it were entertainment. To them it was just a broken toy, but to Lily it was the last gift from her mother, who had died only a year ago. That bear had been her comfort at night when the house felt too quiet, her secret friend she hugged when she missed her mom too much to sleep, her reminder that love had once wrapped her tightly in warm arms. And now, in a careless act of cruelty, the children had destroyed the only piece of her that still felt alive. Lily whispered through her sobs, her words almost drowned by the laughter around her, "Please, don't laugh, it was from my mommy." But her plea was swallowed by their ridicule. She lowered her head, pressing the broken bear to her chest as if she could shield it, as if her embrace could bring it back to life. She wanted to scream, but her throat burned with helplessness. At 5 years old she already knew what it felt like to lose everything. Her mother's death had left a hollow silence in her world, and though her grandmother did her best, there were moments like this when the loneliness was unbearable. She felt invisible, defenseless, as if the world had decided she was too small to matter. The laughter of the children seemed endless, their voices louder than her sobs, and Lily's tears fell harder, soaking the soft fur of the ruined toy. She thought of her mother's smile, of the day she had received the bear wrapped in paper decorated with stars, her mother whispering, "Whenever you're scared or sad, hold him tight and you'll feel me near." Now that comfort was gone, ripped apart by hands that didn't care, and all Lily could do was cry into the fading daylight, alone in her grief while others stood above her, laughing at her pain. In that moment Lily felt the world had turned its back on her completely. The bear, once her shield, now looked broken and pitiful, much like she felt inside. She pressed her forehead against it, wishing for her mother, wishing for someone, anyone, who could see her not as the lonely girl with a broken toy, but as someone worth protecting. It was a silent wish, whispered only in her heart, but it carried the weight of all her sorrow, a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, someone would hear. On the other side of the street a tall man stepped out of a sleek black car, adjusting the cuffs of his light blue suit. His name was Michael Hayes, the CEO of one of the largest corporations in the city, a man known to many for his wealth, influence, and commanding presence. His dark hair caught the last glow of the sunset, his piercing blue eyes scanning the area with practiced detachment as he prepared to walk into the small community center to finalize a donation agreement for a local charity. He had done this countless times before, cutting checks, shaking hands, and moving on, never lingering long enough to become emotionally involved. To him it was just another task on a long list, another gesture of goodwill that would make headlines and paint his image in softer colors. But as he passed the kindergarten gate his gaze fell on a small figure crouched in the dirt, and for the first time in years his steps slowed. He noticed the little girl first by the sound of her sobs, so faint they might have gone unheard by anyone not paying attention. Her small frame was curled inward, her shoulders shaking as she clutched something torn and pitiful in her hands. Around her stood a cluster of children, their faces bright with laughter that struck him as cruel, their fingers pointing at her as if her pain was nothing more than a spectacle. Michael's brow furrowed, and he instinctively drew closer, his tall frame casting a shadow across the scene. He could now see the toy she held so desperately, a white teddy bear, its head ripped off and stuffing spilling through a jagged seam. The sight was almost grotesque in its symbolism, a child's comfort destroyed in the most thoughtless way. Michael stopped for a moment, watching the girl's tear-stained face, her wide brown eyes shimmering with despair as she pressed the broken bear against her chest. Something inside him shifted uncomfortably, a memory surfacing from the depths of his mind. He had been a boy once, not much older than her, when he had lost his own parents in a sudden accident. He remembered clutching a toy car until the paint chipped off, holding onto it as if it could anchor him to a world that no longer made sense. Looking at her now, it was as though time had folded back on itself and shown him a reflection of his own past. He realized he could walk away. It would be the simplest thing, to ignore the scene, to remind himself he was here for business and not sentiment. But his legs refused to move. Something about the girl's trembling hands, about the way she tried to whisper through her sobs that the bear had been from her mother, pierced through the layers of armor he had built around his life. He saw not just a child with a broken toy, but a soul abandoned, mocked by the world for daring to love something too deeply. His jaw tightened, and without thinking, Michael pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The laughter quieted almost immediately as the children noticed the imposing figure in the tailored suit approaching. His presence carried weight, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable, and one by one the children fell back, their amusement fading into an uneasy silence. But the little girl did not look up. She continued to cry into the bear's soft fur, her tears soaking into it, her body trembling with each breath. Michael crouched down, lowering himself until his tall frame was level with hers. For a moment he didn't speak, only looked at her, seeing the pain etched so clearly across her face, a kind of pain far too heavy for a 5-year-old to bear. His hand hovered for a moment before he gently touched the ground beside her, his voice calm but firm as he finally spoke. "What happened to your bear?" The girl flinched slightly at the sound of his voice, as though she hadn't expected anyone to care enough to ask. She lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen, and whispered in a trembling voice, "They broke him. It was from my mommy, she's gone, and now he's gone too." Her words hit him with an unexpected force, pulling at something deep within him that had long been dormant. He felt his chest tighten, and for the first time in years he struggled to find the right thing to say. All he knew was that he could not, under any circumstances, leave her like this. Michael stayed crouched in front of the little girl longer than he expected, unable to pull himself away from the sadness in her trembling voice. Around them the children who had been laughing only minutes before now stood awkwardly in a semicircle, their smirks gone, their eyes darting between each other and the tall man in the blue suit. The authority in his presence had silenced them, but it wasn't fear alone that unsettled them. It was the way he looked at the girl, as if she were the only person in the world who mattered at that moment. They weren't used to seeing adults stop and notice her pain, let alone someone so powerful and intimidating. Lily clutched the headless teddy tighter, her little fingers stained with dirt and her cheeks streaked with tears. She tried to avert her eyes, embarrassed by the attention, but Michael didn't let her retreat into herself. His voice softened, quieter now, stripped of the sharp edge he often used in boardrooms. "Do you still want to keep him?" he asked, glancing at the ruined bear. The question was simple, but it carried a weight she understood immediately. Her lip quivered, and she nodded quickly, whispering, "He's all I have left of her." Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her she had more than a broken bear, that she still had her own strength, that she still carried her mother's love inside her, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, he extended his hand slowly, giving her time to decide if she wanted to take it. To his surprise, after a long pause, she reached out with her tiny hand and let her fingers curl around his. The touch was hesitant, fragile, but it was also a silent act of trust, and for Michael it struck deeper than any handshake or business deal ever had. The children nearby shuffled uncomfortably, their earlier cruelty now heavy with guilt. Michael turned his gaze toward them, and though he didn't raise his voice, his words carried the kind of power that made even adults fall silent. Is this what you think is funny? Taking away something that can't be replaced? His eyes swept over them, cold and unyielding, and the children lowered their heads one by one. None of them dared to answer. He could have scolded them further, but he realized this moment wasn't about them. It was about the girl still holding onto him with desperate fingers, afraid to let go. Michael shifted his attention back to her, and for the first time, Lily let herself meet his eyes fully. She expected to see the same distant pity adults usually gave her, but instead there was something different. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, as if he understood exactly what it meant to lose someone irreplaceable. He didn't look away from her sadness, he held it with her, making it feel a little less unbearable. The sound of the evening traffic drifted faintly from beyond the fence, but within the kindergarten yard there was an almost sacred stillness, as though the world itself was pausing to witness something fragile. Michael said quietly, "I lost my parents when I was young too." The confession surprised him as much as it did her. He rarely spoke about it, not even to the closest people in his life, but looking at her, he couldn't hold it back. "I know what it feels like to have something torn away that you can never get back." Lily blinked at him, her sobs easing into shaky breaths. No one had ever told her they understood. Adults told her to be strong, to move on, to stop crying, but this man wasn't telling her to forget. He was telling her she wasn't alone in the pain. She leaned a little closer to him, still hugging the broken bear with one arm while holding onto his hand with the other. For the first time that day, the fear in her eyes softened. Michael knew he couldn't fix everything for her, but he could do something. He gently touched the torn seam of the bear and said, "We can fix him. It won't be easy, and he won't look the same, but we can make him whole again." She stared at him, her small face caught between disbelief and hope. "Really?" she whispered, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear it. He nodded. "Really? But you'll have to trust me." That was when something extraordinary happened. The little girl, whose world had been cracked open by loss, managed the smallest, trembling smile through her tears. It was faint, fleeting, but it was the first spark of light breaking through her darkness. And for Michael, it felt like a promise, that this wasn't the end of her story, but the fragile beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. Michael carried that moment with him long after he left the kindergarten yard, the weight of the little girl's fragile smile pressed deep into his mind. He had built a life where everything was controlled, calculated, and planned, yet nothing could have prepared him for the raw truth in Lily's eyes. That night, while the city glittered outside his penthouse windows, he found himself staring at the ceiling instead of reading the report stacked on his desk. He kept picturing her crouched on the ground, hugging the torn bear as though her entire existence depended on it. He thought of the way her small fingers had clung to his hand, not because he was powerful or rich, but because she needed someone she could trust, if only for a moment. For a man who had spent decades surrounded by people who respected his money but never touched his soul, the memory unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. The next morning he made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of driving straight to his office, where meetings and deadlines waited, he diverted his driver to a modest fabric shop tucked between two larger storefronts downtown. The bell above the door chimed softly when he stepped inside, the smell of cotton and dye filling the air. An elderly seamstress looked up from her counter, startled to see a man in such an immaculate light blue suit in her humble shop. Michael placed the broken bear on the counter with careful hands, almost reverent, and said in a voice that carried both command and vulnerability, "Can you help me fix this?" The woman studied the toy, noticing the frayed edges and the stuffing that spilled from the torn neck. She lifted her eyes to his and saw something rare, a man who looked like he could command the world, yet at that moment seemed completely powerless in the face of a child's grief. Without hesitation, she nodded. "It won't be the same as before," she warned gently, "but I can make it strong again." Her words struck him in an unexpected way, echoing what he had told Lily. For hours, Michael stayed in the shop, watching as the woman's skilled fingers worked the needle through fabric, stitching with care. He wasn't used to waiting for anything, yet he found himself strangely patient, as if this task carried more importance than any contract waiting on his desk. When the bear was finally whole again, with a faint scar where the head had been reattached, he felt an unexpected rush of relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was stronger, and he imagined Lily's small hands holding it again with hope instead of despair. That afternoon he returned to the kindergarten. The children were playing outside again, their laughter filling the air, but this time when they saw him, their giggles faltered into silence. Lily was sitting by herself on a wooden bench, her brown eyes distant as she traced patterns in the dirt with her shoe. When she looked up and saw him walking toward her, her face lit with confusion and disbelief. Michael knelt down to her level, opened the box he carried, and revealed the mended bear. Her gasp was sharp and full of wonder. She reached out with trembling fingers, touching the seam where the bear had been stitched, and then hugged it to her chest as though she had been given back a piece of her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were different this time, softer, filled with gratitude instead of pain. "You fixed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. Michael smiled faintly. "No, we fixed him. He's stronger now, and so are you." He hadn't planned those words, but they came naturally, as if he had been speaking them to himself as much as to her. Lily looked at him for a long moment, her small face still wet with tears, and then she threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly. The embrace startled him, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he felt something inside him loosen, a quiet crack in the armor he had worn for years. For the children who watched from a distance, the scene left them unsettled. The man they had once only known as a distant figure of power had chosen to kneel on the ground beside the girl they had mocked. Some felt shame, others envy, but all of them understood that something had changed. The balance of their little world had shifted, and Lily was no longer just the girl with the broken toy. As Michael walked back to his car later, the bear restored and Lily's smile etched in his memory, he knew this was not the end. He couldn't simply return to his old life and forget her. There was something about her loneliness that resonated with his own, something about her fight to hold on to love that mirrored his own buried battles. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he sensed their stories had just begun to intertwine, and that realization filled him with both fear and a strange, unexpected hope. Michael could not stay away from Lily after that day. What began as a single act of compassion soon became something he found himself drawn back to over and over again. The image of her small frame clutching the mended bear lingered in his mind during board meetings, through long dinners with investors, and even in the quiet hours of the night when he stood looking out at the skyline from his glass tower of solitude. He realized that wealth had bought him everything except the one thing Lily had unknowingly given him in that moment on the kindergarten bench, a sense of purpose that extended beyond himself. The following week he arranged for his driver to take him back to the small neighborhood where Lily lived with her grandmother. He didn't announce his arrival with grandeur. Instead, he walked through the modest gate of their worn-out yard and knocked gently on the door, uncertain if he was crossing a line yet unable to stop himself. Her grandmother, a frail woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, opened the door and looked at him with suspicion. She recognized him immediately, not by his name, but by his immaculate suit and the aura of authority he carried with him. Before she could ask, Lily appeared behind her, the mended bear in her arms. Her eyes lit up at the sight of him, and she rushed forward to hug his leg without hesitation. The grandmother's wary expression softened slightly at the sight of Lily's joy, though her tone remained guarded as she asked what a man like him wanted with a child like hers. Michael explained simply that he wanted to make sure Lily was all right, that no child should suffer ridicule or carry so much pain alone. His words were careful, not polished like the speeches he gave to shareholders, but sincere, and perhaps that sincerity was what convinced the old woman to let him step inside. The small apartment smelled faintly of herbs and worn wood. It was tidy but bore the marks of poverty, peeling wallpaper, creaking floorboards, and furniture that had been repaired too many times. Michael noticed every detail, and each one struck him harder than the next. For a man who had grown used to excess, this humble space revealed a world he rarely acknowledged. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor with her bear, glancing up at him every few seconds as though afraid he might vanish if she looked away too long. Over cups of tea poured into chipped mugs, the grandmother finally told him their story. Lily's mother had passed away from an illness that had drained every last bit of their savings. The girl's father had disappeared long before, leaving nothing but unanswered questions. Since then, it had been just the two of them, surviving on the grandmother's meager pension and the occasional odd job she managed to pick up despite her age. The bear, she explained, had been the last gift Lily's mother managed to give her before her passing, and when it had been torn apart, it was as if the child had lost her mother all over again. Michael listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with each detail. He had heard stories of hardship before, but never one that had pierced his guarded heart so deeply. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the voice of a CEO but with the quiet conviction of a man who had seen too much loneliness in his own life. He told the grandmother he didn't want to replace her or overstep his place, but he wanted to be there for Lily, to help ensure she had a chance at a future where her grief didn't define her. The old woman's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide, and she gave a small nod, the weight of pride and desperation colliding inside her. From that evening on, Michael became a regular presence. Sometimes he arrived with books, sometimes with new pencils and sketch pads when he discovered Lily loved to draw, and sometimes with nothing but time to sit on the floor beside her and listen to her talk about her mother, her fears, and her dreams. He was startled by how natural it felt, how her laughter began to chip away at the emptiness inside him, how her trust filled a silence he hadn't realized was so unbearable. He had spent a lifetime building walls made of glass and steel, yet here, in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper, he felt more human than he ever had in his vast empire. For Lily, his presence became more than kindness, it became an anchor. Every time he stepped through the door, she felt less like the broken girl clutching a wounded bear and more like a child who was seen, valued, and loved. She didn't understand the full depth of who he was in the outside world, but to her, he was not a millionaire or a powerful man. He was simply the one who had knelt down in the dirt to restore her treasure, the one who had chosen to see her pain when others only laughed. What neither of them fully grasped yet was that their lives, so different in circumstance, had begun to weave together in a way that would alter both of their destinies forever. Michael's world had always been defined by control, precision, and the ruthless efficiency of his empire, yet the more time he spent with Lily, the more that carefully constructed order began to unravel in ways he had never anticipated. The office, with its constant demands and the chorus of advisors vying for his attention, seemed dull compared to the warmth of that small apartment where a little girl's laughter carried more weight than any profit margin. At first, he kept his visits discreet, not wanting the press or his shareholders to twist something pure into scandal, but he quickly realized that secrecy was impossible when his absence from meetings grew more frequent and his priorities shifted in ways his board could not understand. He was no longer just the unshakable CEO but a man caught between two worlds, one made of marble and glass, and the other of cracked walls and threadbare rugs, yet it was the latter that gave him peace. Lily, for her part, clung to Michael's presence with an instinctive sense that he would never leave her side, though her young mind could not fully articulate why. Each time she heard his footsteps in the hallway, she rushed to the door with a mixture of joy and relief, afraid that if she didn't move fast enough he might disappear like her father had. She began to talk about him at school, and though some children mocked her, claiming she made up stories about a powerful man who cared for her, Lily didn't mind. For once, she had a truth that was hers to hold, a truth no ridicule could take away. Michael had become the quiet hero of her fragile world, the man who sat cross-legged on the floor beside her and let her draw pictures of stars and castles, who never laughed when she cried, and who stitched not just the seams of her bare but the hidden fractures of her heart. The grandmother, though grateful, watched with unease. She had lived long enough to know that nothing came without a cost, and though Michael spoke softly and carried himself with respect, she couldn't stop the gnawing fear that perhaps he was too good to be true. One evening, as Lily fell asleep with her bear tucked under her chin, she confronted him directly, asking what his true intentions were, her frail hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Michael's reply was not rehearsed, not polished, but raw. He admitted that his wealth had never filled the void left by his own broken childhood, that in Lily's eyes he saw the same loneliness he had once carried, and that helping her was not charity but redemption. He confessed he didn't fully know what he was becoming in her life, but he knew he wanted to protect her, to give her the opportunities he never had, and to make sure she never again felt abandoned in a world too cruel for someone so small. The grandmother's suspicion softened into reluctant trust, and for the first time, she thanked him with sincerity. She told him that Lily needed stability, that promises meant everything to a child who had already lost so much, and that if he were to remain in her life, he must never waver. Michael gave his word, not as a businessman used to sealing deals, but as a man who understood that this was a vow heavier than any contract he had ever signed. As the weeks unfolded, his life outside the small apartment began to shift in ways his colleagues could not ignore. Reports piled up unanswered, investors complained about his absences, and whispers began to circle that Michael Reed, the untouchable CEO, was losing focus. When questioned, he brushed them aside with cold efficiency, but inside he knew the truth: his empire had never mattered less. What mattered was a little girl who once wept over a torn bear and now laughed freely in his presence, a girl who deserved more than just survival, who deserved a chance to dream without fear. The turning point came one night when Lily timidly asked him if he would come to her school's small performance, a simple recital that other parents would attend. She said it quickly, as though afraid the question itself was too much to ask, but her eyes betrayed the depth of her longing. Michael, struck silent for a moment, realized this was not just another evening for her, it was her chance to stand before her classmates and prove she was not alone. Without hesitation, he promised he would be there, and for the first time in years, he found himself nervous about keeping a commitment, not because of logistics or power, but because he understood how fragile trust could be in the heart of a child who had already been abandoned once. That night, as he drove back to his penthouse, he stared out at the city lights and felt the weight of his choices pressing in. He was a man with more wealth than he could ever spend, more influence than most could dream of, yet all of it paled against the responsibility he now carried. For Lily, he was not a CEO, not a millionaire, but simply the person who had chosen to kneel beside her when everyone else laughed. And as he lay awake in the silence of his sprawling home, he knew with certainty that protecting that fragile trust, and nurturing the bond that had begun so unexpectedly, would define the rest of his life in ways he had never imagined. The day of Lily's school recital arrived with a weight Michael hadn't felt in years, heavier than any board meeting or public address he had ever given. He sat in his car outside the small community school, watching as parents led their children inside with the casual ease of people who never questioned whether they belonged. He realized with a pang that for Lily, this moment meant everything, not just the chance to sing or stand on a stage, but the chance to show that she was not forgotten, that she had someone who would sit in the audience and clap for her when the performance ended. As he stepped out of the car, dressed not in his usual sharp suit but in something softer, more approachable, he felt the tension in his chest, aware that if he faltered even slightly, the fragile trust Lily had given him could fracture beyond repair. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with laughter and chatter, children darting about in small costumes while parents snapped pictures and found their seats. Michael spotted Lily backstage, peeking nervously from behind the curtain, her small hands twisting the hem of her red blouse, the bear with its stitched head clutched tightly against her side for courage. When she caught sight of him slipping into a seat near the front, her entire face lit up in a way that silenced every doubt he had carried with him. For that moment, it was as if the room disappeared and only the two of them existed, bound by a promise kept. When the performance began, Michael sat straighter than he ever had in the most prestigious of venues. His eyes never left Lily, who stood in the second row, her voice small but steady as she followed along with the other children. She wavered at first, glancing at the crowd, but every time her eyes found Michael's, she steadied herself again, drawing strength from the fact that he was there. And when her solo part came, a short verse that she had been terrified to sing, her voice shook only for a moment before rising clear and pure, surprising even herself. The room erupted in applause, but Michael noticed only the pride in her eyes as she smiled shyly and clutched the bear tighter. Afterward, as children rushed to their parents, Lily darted across the stage and ran straight into Michael's arms. She held him tightly, whispering a shaky, "Thank you," into his shoulder, as if the words themselves could capture the depth of what his presence had meant. He lifted her easily, his arms steady around her, and for the first time in years he felt something close to completeness, a sense that all the power and wealth in the world meant nothing compared to being the one person who could give this child the security she deserved. But as he carried her out of the crowded room, he also felt the piercing stares of others. Some parents looked on with curiosity, whispering as they tried to piece together why a man like him would be here for a little girl who clearly was not his own. The rumors he had once brushed aside now began to feel real, shadows waiting to swallow the fragile happiness he and Lily were beginning to build. Yet when she looked up at him, her small hand gripping his as if it were her only anchor in the world, he knew he could endure any amount of gossip, any attack on his reputation, if it meant protecting the light that had returned to her eyes. That night, back at her grandmother's home, Lily refused to let go of his hand for hours, falling asleep on the couch beside him while the patched bear rested against her chest. Michael sat there in silence, watching the rise and fall of her breath, and in that quiet he realized there was no turning back. He was no longer simply a visitor in her world, a fleeting comfort that might disappear with time. He had become something far more permanent, something she depended on, and in that realization lay both the heaviest burden and the greatest purpose he had ever known. For the first time in his life, the path ahead was not measured in profits or accolades but in promises, and he was determined that this was one promise he would never break. Weeks turned into months, and what began as chance encounters and hesitant gestures grew into something deeper and undeniable. Michael found himself rearranging his schedule, canceling high-profile meetings, and ignoring calls from influential board members just to make time for Lily. At first, he told himself it was temporary, a way to help a grieving child through a difficult season, but with each passing day he realized that this was no act of charity. It was a transformation, one that reached into the deepest parts of his life and rewrote everything he thought he knew about happiness. The man who had once lived in glass towers, measuring worth by profits and achievements, was now spending evenings in a small living room filled with children's drawings, helping a 5-year-old sound out words from picture books and laughing at her imaginative stories about teddy bears who could talk. The bond between them grew so natural that even her grandmother began to notice. She would watch the way Lily's face brightened whenever Michael entered the room, how the child's laughter came easier now, unburdened by the shadows of loneliness. One evening, as Michael sat with Lily sleeping against his shoulder, the grandmother quietly placed a hand on his arm and whispered with a seriousness that startled him, "She sees you as family now. And you should know, you are the reason she's healing." The word struck him like a vow he hadn't spoken but had already made with every choice, every time he showed up when Lily needed him. Yet outside their fragile cocoon, the world grew louder. Tabloids began to run speculative stories about the millionaire CEO seen with a little girl who wasn't his, reporters hung outside his company offices, and whispers among his peers grew sharper. Some accused him of hiding scandals, others painted him as unstable, a man too distracted by personal affairs to lead. The board demanded explanations, but Michael refused to let go. For the first time, he looked his critics in the eye and said the one thing they never expected from him: "This is my life now, and she is part of it. If I must choose between my empire and that child's well-being, then the empire can burn." It was reckless, even dangerous, but it was also the first time his words carried the full force of truth, unshaken by fear of consequence. The turning point came one cold afternoon when Lily, standing in the schoolyard with her patched teddy bear in hand, lifted her chin to a group of children who once mocked her. They had begun to laugh again, but this time she looked at them with a new strength. She told them calmly, "It doesn't matter if you laugh. I'm not alone anymore." And as she ran into Michael's waiting arms at the gate, her smile radiant and fearless, the scene captured by a passing photographer spread like wildfire across the media. The story, twisted at first by gossip, quickly shifted when the truth came out. People learned about Lily's loss, about her broken bear, and about the man who had quietly stepped in to protect and nurture her when no one else had. What began as whispers of scandal turned into praise, as families across the city recognized in Michael something rare, something more valuable than wealth: humanity. In the months that followed, Michael's company found itself more respected than ever, not because of financial gains, but because people began to see him as more than a cold figure of power. He was a man who had chosen love over image, a man who had refused to abandon a child who needed him. And for Lily, the change was even greater. She began to laugh again, not the nervous giggles of a child masking pain, but the free, unguarded laughter of a little girl who finally felt safe. She carried her teddy bear everywhere, its stitched head a symbol not of loss but of survival, and every night she fell asleep knowing that someone would be there when she woke. On one quiet evening, Michael sat on the porch of her grandmother's house, watching Lily chase fireflies in the yard. The light of the setting sun cast her in a golden glow, her hair shining like copper against the sky. She stopped suddenly, ran back to him, and placed the patched bear in his lap. "Mommy gave him to me," she said softly, "but now he's ours. Because you're my family too." The words brought a lump to his throat, and for the first time in decades, he allowed tears to fall freely, not from loss but from the overwhelming realization that his life, once built on hollow victories, had finally found its true meaning. From that night onward, there was no doubt. Michael was no longer just a man defined by wealth and titles. He was a father in every way that mattered, and Lily, once broken by grief and cruelty, was now a child reborn into hope. Together they stood as proof that love could rise from the most unexpected places, that even the darkest sorrow could be transformed into light. And though the world would always remember Michael as a powerful millionaire, he knew the only legacy that truly mattered was the one written in the laughter of a little girl and the stitched seams of a teddy bear who had survived, just like them. This story, to me, is about how true wealth has nothing to do with money or power but with the courage to love when it's hardest. Michael's journey shows that compassion can rewrite even the darkest chapters of someone's life, and Lily's transformation proves that hope can be reborn from the smallest gestures of kindness. What struck me most is that the shocking part wasn't the scandal the world expected, but the simple, breathtaking truth that a broken toy and a grieving child could heal a man who seemed untouchable. The ending isn't just happy, it's a reminder that the most extraordinary miracles often come from the most ordinary choices to care.